February. The herd of goats were expertly handled, and as we shouted out an obrigado, we noticed that the shepherd had Down syndrome. I imagined the peaceful rural setting being an environment that would ultimately be protective. Breathing in sunshine. Here in our part of central Portugal, the landscape is turning yellow, and with the horizon open to us, the lengthening of the days are already noticeable. January had surprised us with clear blue skies that brought white fields and golden sunshine. And February continues to surprise us as spring weather enters our lives. It is the time of year that many in Britain consider to be the gloomiest, when the sparkle of Christmas has abated and the longer, brighter days which are promised once the clocks go forward at the end of March feel frightfully far away. Gorse blooms from ground to above shoulder height. More delicate flowers of the same colour carpet the ground and call for the attention of bees and other pollinating insects. And reaching high into the sky beside the paths we walk along and on wooded slopes we drive below, trees with fine fern foliage produce little balls of yellow, about the size of peppercorns. We see the small balls develop into miniature versions of the tennis ball sized pom-pom the cats knock about our home. You know the thing I mean, made by winding wool around cardboard donuts. One evening, as I am passing through fields that lay below our house, I hear the bells of the church in Villanova ring the hour of 6. And looking in that direction, I see the metal cross atop the spire hit by shafts of sun which turn it golden. Growing. The awakening surroundings was only the beginning of us witnessing how moving our world is, from an emotional as well as a physical sense. Because over the year we saw the setting sun travel from left to right in our field of vision. And the plough, this being the only constellation of stars that either of us had recognised in the night sky, assumed different positions as the physical journey on which our planet travels through space was demonstrated to us. We were reminded of our last night in London, when we had snuggled down on our inflatable mattress and through the window above the park where we had met, we had consciously noted the few bright stars managing to make their way through the light pollution of the city. With the feel of springtime in the air, we reviewed the situation of our crops, and as we rather and grandly referred to the seeds we had planted. The beans and peas appeared established. The basil was young, but showed promise as little round-ended leaves clustered together on delicate stems. And what we thought had been tomatoes breaking through the earth were now blatantly flaunting themselves as weeds. We had observed that Miranda de Corvo Market was a place to buy young plants that had been nurtured into plugs, which were ready to plant outside. And one Wednesday, Stephen and I set off to purchase a few tomato plants. Of course, the choice of other fruit and vegetables was too tempting to walk away from, and our path was set to branch out into melons, bell and chili peppers, the latter being something neither of us had consciously eaten before, but which would soon become a favourite seasoning of ours. We had been in Portugal for a couple of months by this time, and we both felt that enough time had elapsed for the cats to have familiarised themselves with the new surroundings, and to feel that they were at home. So, with no small amount of anxiety, Stephen gave his girls a gift: the world outside four walls. Ferenc had recounted stories to us about indoor cats that are so overwhelmed when they are given the freedom to roam outside they became paralysed after only a few steps, and that the opportunity is embraced but curiosity stops at the garden fence. It was a day when gusts of quite strong wind appeared from nowhere, and it ruffled Muffin's fur, We saw her flinch and look around, not understanding where this thing was that had pushed against her. But if the other cat was concerned about the invisible attacker, she did not show it at that time, fascinated more by the feel of the earth underfoot, and uneasy about the slight sinking which accompanied her steps. The cats ventured away from us and the door, little by little on that first day, but not far. On successive days of open doors, there were more opportunities provided for them to explore further, and as they encountered a world where so much was genuinely alien to them, Stephen and I were discovering that we too needed a new perspective on familiar things such as the four seasons. Winter in London for me had consisted of Decembers that were filled with wishes of snow, but in reality they equated with getting up when it was dark, travelling home from work in the dark, and a general grey sandwich between these two. That, lucky for us in the Northern Hemisphere, has the relief of Christmas lights. Januaries and Februaries lingered irrationally in my mind, as I could not help believing that the passing of the shortest day and our journey towards summertime should have been more noticeable after a couple of months. Snow would finally arrive in February, and the initial joy would change too quickly to anxiety as the pavements became ice rinks. I had fallen and fractured a bone in my hand 2 years previously on an icy London street. Of course, spring in London was always beautiful. Crocus and daffodil bulbs pushed through their green shoots into lawns and parks and communal green spaces surrounding council estates, which made a stark contrast to the rundown concrete blocks themselves. Trees lined streets on railway land budded and unfurled fresh green leaves, and the light came through to a reawakening capital city when bright sunshine hit wet streets and reflected from the glass and steel of office buildings or radiated from smiles on faces that were no longer buried in hoods and scarves. As the next season took over in London, the warmth had often brought freedom in the form of long summer nights. But even then, the time available once the working day had finished was often marred by the irritability that came after sleepless nights in stuffy rooms. And though autumn brought splendid colours and sounds, from leaves that hung on trees in transitory tones of orange, yellow, red, and warm brown before falling and rustling along pavements, these became as hazardous as the winter ice once they had lain in the rain. So seasons were not new to Stephen and me, but we learnt that we needed to form new relationships with winters that were bright, crisp, wet, and short. At this time, we discovered bed sheets in the market that were brushed cotton and felt warm to the touch despite the chill grip of the night. The shorts and t-shirts that we had put on after showers and baths in the London flat found their way to the bottom of drawers as long jogging bottoms, long sleeve tops and thick hiking socks were purchased. And the ease of wiping over floor tiles was forfeited for the warmth and comfort of a big rug placed in front of the fire. It was in February that spring that the stewardship changed, and for the world, the following passage. Let me start that again. It was in February that spring. No, start again. It was in February that spring began its stewardship of our world, and the following passage is something I wrote in a notebook as the second month of the year started. The house feels different this evening. After a few days of temperatures which are in their high teens and low 20s, and a noticeable lengthening of daylight, the windows are open and there is warmth in the rooms as the sunlight touches a linen basket, reflects on the polished side of the wardrobe in the bedroom, and bathes the walls of the summer room. Clearing up a misunderstanding, if not the weather. When we left England, we had extended open invitations to friends and family to visit us in our new home. And on the 17th of February, one of my sisters and her husband came out to see us. We met Kim and Chris at the airport, and the few days that they were here passed quickly. Toast and coffee at the Café Miranda de Cordoval on the edge of Plaza José Falcão started the days. We had a large meal at midday. Cheese, crackers, and wine, which was provided by the Major, were consumed on our veranda while catching the last of the daylight. We spent our nights in front of the fire watching a DVD. Stephen and I enjoyed showing off our new home, and my sister and brother-in-law enjoyed their break with us, if only because it was the first time in many years that it had been Kim and Chris, and not Mum and Dad. My sister's back had been operated on the year before Stephen and I moved away, and because it was something which still caused pain, we gave up our bedroom and moved into the room next door. Kim and Chris had the ship's lantern, which we had brought back in January, hanging outside the window, casting soft candlelight as they drifted off to sleep. The novelty for Stephen and I was being able to open the veranda door wide and sit up on our inflatable mattress, gazing at the distant mountains. We did not visit many places because the weather provided at least a little rain on each of the 4 days they were here. But time was filled pleasurably with just day-to-day living. And on the last day that Kim and Chris were here, Stephen and I asked for their help with collecting pine cones. We had been told by a neighbour that the tall pine trees near the Chapel of Sant Antonio, which is about a 15-minute walk from where we live, drop nature's firelighters in abundance. And as we approached the wooded area, Stephen recognised the car which was parked there. We passed the open door to the little church, and inside we saw Ruth and another lady who we did not know, sweeping the floor and placing vases of fresh cut flowers on tables and in alcoves around the walls. We shouted a "Boa tarde," and the two people stopped what they were doing and came out to greet us. It was during the introductions between our neighbours and our family when we learnt that the name of the lady we had spent 2 months calling Ruth was not that at all. The misunderstanding had occurred back in December, after our salamander had been installed and we faced a challenge of buying firewood. John, who had bought our house from, visited us with an English lady called Mary the day after we had acquired our wood burner. And although Mary lived in a different village, she was familiar with ours because she looked after the holiday home next door to us, owned by a British couple. We learnt from our visitors that the Portuguese word for firewood is lenha, and that we could probably buy it from our neighbour, the Major. Stephen and I were certainly familiar with the stacks of logs that lined the road of his land, and later that afternoon we went along to our neighbour's house to ask about buying some lenha from him. The Major informed us that age and poor health had stopped him selling wood, and the segmented trunks of pine that we saw were for him and his family. But he gave us the name of another neighbour who could help. The initial left turn we took at the end of our road on our way to the house of Pedro was the first indication we had completely misunderstood the directions the Major had given us. As we looked at the couple of houses along that part of the road, a lady who looked to be in her early 70s, wearing black and having the shape of a Russian doll, was approaching us from the opposite direction. "Boa tarde," we said. "Boa tarde," came the reply, accompanied by a smile. "A casa de Pedro?" I asked, indicating the two houses. A friendly tone accompanied the words, which came back, but with a tongue that produced them far too quickly for us to grasp. Lucky, it was easier for us to comprehend her physical instructions than her oral ones, and we modified our course by walking back the way we had come and following the road a little past our turning. Although the traditional houses here no longer have livestock stabled beneath them, ground floor space is rarely lived in and is used primarily for storage of tools that still work the land, storage for wine, and occasionally a washing machine or freezer. After a 2-minute walk and a spot just inside a large yard, there were various barns that we could see and some chickens clucking, as well as the bar of sheep. The Russian doll caught us up where we had stopped. We were reassured that this was the house we were looking for, but Stephen and I remained reluctant to cross the expanse of concrete and climb the steps up to the porch. We hesitated for a few minutes more, and then, frustrated with us both for our lack of courage, I walked up the stairs, saw a rack of shoes beside a door which had been out of sight from the road, knocked at the wooden panels with my knuckles, and I took a step backwards. A woman with a stern face answered the door, and I recited the speech I had practiced in my head. Quero comprar leña. She appeared to understand that I wanted to buy firewood, and I understood that it was with her husband that I needed to speak. The man was not there at that time, so I should return around 4 o'clock. A slight tension between Steve and me accompanied us on our walk home, and it was alone that he left our place at 4 o'clock to return to the house of the wood seller. I later considered it was very unfair that I had left him to go alone, but it was often the case during that time, when we lacked confidence and ability to express ourselves, that we took our frustrations out on each other. When Stephen returned, he told me that he had neared Pedro's house, but then, just before reaching it, he'd seen some figures deep in conversation at the nearby bus stop. One of the people in the small group was the woman who had earlier given us directions, and having caught her eye as he approached, she beckoned Stephen over and introduced him to Pedro, who was one of the other 4 people present. A man who appeared as severe as his wife told Stephen to be at his house the following day to discuss the firewood we wanted. So the next day we both went along, tension between us replaced by the respect each of us rightfully deserved for the other and from the other, and the support that we needed in greater support that would be needed in greater strength while we continued to build a new life for ourselves in Portugal. The 2 people who we spoke to the following day were not stern, and as we got to know them, we believed that it was weariness that we had seen on their faces during those first meetings. From December to February, we bought leña from our neighbours twice more, on the first occasion learning how to stack it securely. And as winter intensified and then abated, Pedro and his wife became friends. It was from them that we learnt about using pine cones to light the fire. We were shown around their land where they kept pigs as well as sheep and chickens, whose eggs, along with cabbages and bags of oranges, they gave us on several occasions. Though Stephen and I felt humbled by the kindness our neighbours showed us, we also felt that we were being accepted, and we became more resolved than ever to be able to communicate fuller with the people who engaged us in conversation and persevered with our blank expressions on obvious bluffs. We could do little to show our gratitude for the eggs. Buying a gift would have felt wrong, but as with the Major and Maria, we left a home-baked loaf of bread with a thank you note addressed to Pedro and Ruth. So, it was embarrassment that 2 months after those introductions between ourselves and Ruth had occurred, we heard our neighbour repeat her name 5 or 6 times to my sister and brother-in-law, and it dawned on us that she was in fact called Lourdes. Unfortunately, as one misunderstanding was cleared up, another one began when we were introduced to the lady who was with her at the chapel. Carnival. Blighty has Pancake Day. Portugal has Carnival. We were in Portugal the previous year when Stephen had treated me to a break in Lisbon for my birthday, and we'd taken our second look at what would then become our new home. We had sat in a cafe in Coimbra and watched pictures on the television of scantily dressed women with elaborate headdresses and costumes of feather and sparkle waiting to start a carnival parade. On the other side of the glass to where we sat, the city was wet, and the screen on the wall showed the coastal town with pictures that were very different to what we saw outside on the streets, although weather-wise they were faring little better, prompting one of the programme's presenters to comment: "The participants of the parade appear more animated than usual as they await to start off the procession, and that perhaps their high spirits were simply attempts at keeping warm." In 2011, Easter fell later than it had in 2010, and we were now living in Portugal. We had learnt from Isabel at the kiosk that Miranda de Cornwall had its own carnival parade, and we decided to see how the locals celebrated things. Umbrellas, not feathers, were in most people's hands when we took our place amongst spectators by the town hall building, but the sun was shining as the bell of the church above us rang the hour of 3, and just after this, music drifted to us from the opposite direction. Ahead of the parade, the Bombeiros, the emergency services, which in all but the largest cities are voluntary organisations, came along with collection buckets. To begin with, Stephen and I did not understand what the collection was for, but when we later made a contribution, a sticker was placed on our jackets so that we would not be asked for further contribution. People in colourful costumes with painted faces and yellow, red, green and blue wigs came dancing down the street to the beats of Portuguese festa music, which Stephen maintained was too fast and reminded him of Pinky and Perky. Next, there were carnival floats pulled along by cars, vans, lorries and tractors. And we stared disbelievingly at the way national government was mocked. One float decked out as a cage in a zoo showed the animals behind the bars in shirts and ties with rosettes naming the political party or the politician being lampooned in this manner. Another key theme for derision was the town's upgrading of its railway, which had begun a year earlier and was submerged in controversy because the money had run out. The Serra de Estrela. In February, we still managed to get the snow we had been accustomed to in London, but in a reverse of roles, it was we who fell on the snow, not the other way around. One morning before 9 o'clock, with a flask of coffee, some cheese rolls and a bar or two of chocolate, we were ready for our journey to the Serra de Estrela, aiming for the top of Portugal. And after a stop for petrol, Betsy was ready too. We headed off in the direction we had gone on our first attempt to visit the mountain, on the last day of the previous year. But it was a more clement day now than the last time we had set off, and although we were unsure where we had taken the wrong road on our early attempt, there were few other directions to turn in. After an hour, we were driving through towns and villages not encountered before, but the scenery was little different to that which we encountered on many of the drives we had done up until then. It was a few minutes to 11 when we stopped and had a little of our packed lunch in a parking area outside a large church, and we used the stop as an opportunity to stretch our legs. We drank our cups of coffee sitting on the wall above a valley that fell away below us, and the sound of running water carried to us on a breeze that did little to cool faces warmed by the sun. We ate light because we wished to maintain our appetites, and were aiming for lunch between 1 and 2 o'clock in a cafe or restaurant overlooking snowy mountains. Once we had resumed our journey, the scenery started to change as roads began to narrow and would not support two vehicles passing along some of the stretches. Groups of houses appeared clustered in a wilderness that owed no allegiance to parish or council, and with little imagination, circumstances by which the community would be isolated for weeks at the weather's whim seemed a certainty. It was while we passed through this world that we found ourselves behind a herd of 20 or so sheep, which were being herded by a person with Down syndrome. The animals were expertly handled, and we drove past, shouting an obrigado as we did so. It seemed a peaceful environment for someone with the shepherd's condition, and one that would ultimately be protective. Leading the herd was a man with angular features and a sturdy frame, and during the hour and a half that followed, we saw only two other people. Each of them portrayed the same angular features and broader frame. The drive upwards saw tall vegetation almost disappear, and the few trees that persisted struggled to gain half the height the ones on our mountain range reach. Roads twisted and turned, and occasionally we glimpsed the path we would take a little into the future as cars came into sight on other ranges, only to eventually pass us from the opposite direction. Then we drove through a time tunnel, as within minutes the sparseness was filled with hotels, shopping centres, and a retail park, traffic lights, roundabouts, and cars. It was from here we were going to follow a drive-in route suggested by our guidebook. So, heading for the ski resort of Benj de Sode, which is where most of the skiing accommodation appeared to be, in the form of hotels and alpine style chalets, our hopes for finding dinner vanished along with the time. Continuing the drive laid out in our book, we passed a huge reservoir fixed to the side where steps which disappeared into the water some distance below. We guessed that this was a place to ice skate during winter and cool down during the summer months when the Serra became a focus for hikers. But when we were there, it was empty and seemed good for neither one nor the other. We had driven to this mountain range for various reasons. One was because we had harboured dreams of skiing there the following year. But as the inclines became steeper and we feared Betsy would not be able to continue, those ideas melted away. We found our snow at around 1,600 metres, 393 metres short of the top. And as the cold hit us when we stepped out of the car and stepped into drifts on the side of the road, the depths of snow gripped our knees and forced us to topple over. The three of us did climb another 200 metres, but we sensibly decided to retrace our route as anxiety started to encroach on our spirits and replace the joy of snowball fights and the wonder of our white Portugal. Betsy took it easy on our descent, staying in second gear, not trusting herself to stop if she descended too quickly. On our return journey, we stopped in Benj de Sode and our car rested while we rode up a funicular railway to a cafe that was at the top of the steep incline. Surrounded by dark wood panelling, sitting by a narrow window that overlooked the town and mountains, we enjoyed a Portuguese-style custard tart and a coffee before riding the railway back down, not looking forward to the 6-hour drive back home again. Our house appeared in less time than we had feared, but our wanderlust was sated for a while.